Before the war had a name, Vietnam was a land of quiet rhythms. Mornings began with mist rising from rice fields, farmers guiding water buffalo through wet soil, and temples echoing with distant prayers. For centuries, this land had learned how to survive empires. Chinese dynasties came and went. French colonial rulers arrived with railways, taxes, and new borders drawn on maps that ignored villages and families. By the mid-20th century, Vietnam was exhausted but unbroken. The people wanted one thing above all else: independence. Not ideology, not global power, just the right to decide their own future. But the world had other plans for Vietnam, and soon, this peaceful land would become the center of a global confrontation. In 1954, the war quietly began not with gunfire, but with ink on paper. At the Geneva Conference, Vietnam was divided along the 17th parallel. To the north, Ho Chi Minh and a communist government shaped by decades of resistance. To the south, a Western-backed state struggling to define itself. This line was never meant to be permanent, but history has a way of turning temporary decisions into permanent wounds. Families woke up on opposite sides of the border. Brothers became foreigners overnight. What the diplomats called a solution, the Vietnamese people felt as a fracture. And while the world spoke of balance and containment, Vietnam began sliding toward a conflict that no map could control. At first, America watched from a distance. Advisors arrived instead of soldiers. Aid replaced armies. But fear travels faster than reason. In Washington, Vietnam was no longer a country. It was a domino. If it fell, others would follow. This belief reshaped policy, budgets, and lives. Presidents spoke of freedom, but rarely of rice farmers or jungle villages. Slowly, quietly, America stepped deeper into a war it did not yet understand. By the early 1960s, boots replaced briefcases and helicopters replaced handshakes. The conflict was no longer Vietnamese. It was American now. Vietnam did not fight like Europe. There were no clear fronts, no safe rear lines. The jungle itself was alive, hiding, listening, waiting. American soldiers arrived, trained for conventional war, but Vietnam demanded something else. The enemy wore no uniform. Villages could be peaceful at dawn and hostile by night. A footstep could trigger a mine. A smile could hide a warning. Fear became constant, exhaustion permanent. The jungle did not care about technology or firepower. It swallowed both sides equally. The Viet Cong did not aim to defeat America head-on. They aimed to exhaust it. Hit-and-run attacks, tunnels beneath villages, supply routes hidden in plain sight. Every small victory mattered. Every American loss echoed loudly back home. This was a war of patience, and Vietnam had centuries of it. The longer the conflict dragged on, the heavier it became for those who fought far from home. Slowly, the question changed from "how do we win?" to "why are we here?" Napalm changed the color of the war. What once was green turned black. Dropped from the sky, it clung to skin, trees, homes, burning longer than fear itself. Military planners called it effective. Soldiers called it horrifying. Civilians called it the end of their villages. For the first time, war was not only fought by soldiers, it was felt by entire landscapes. Photographs of burning jungles and fleeing families crossed oceans, reaching living rooms thousands of miles away. Vietnam was no longer distant. It was visible, and once seen, it could not be unseen. Some weapons explode. Others whisper. Agent Orange was the quietest. Sprayed to strip the jungle bare, it did its job too well. Trees died. Crops failed. But the real damage unfolded slowly, silently, over decades. Children were born with deformities. Farmers watched land turn against them. Long after the last helicopter left, the war stayed. Vietnam would carry these scars long after the gunfire ended. This was a weapon with no ceasefire. For the first time in history, a war entered homes in real time. Television showed body bags, burning villages, exhausted soldiers. There was no heroic music, no clean victories. College campuses erupted, streets filled with protests. Parents watched sons fight a war they didn't understand. Trust between the government and the people began to crack. Vietnam was no longer just a military issue. It was a moral one. The soldiers who returned were not welcomed as heroes. Many came back confused, broken, silent. They had fought hard, followed orders, and survived, yet felt they had lost something no medal could replace. Post-traumatic stress had no name then, but it lived everywhere. Vietnam followed them home, into dreams and daily life. The war didn't end in 1975 for them. It simply changed form. In April 1975, the war ended not with a treaty, but with helicopters lifting off rooftops. Saigon fell. North Vietnam had won. Crowds pressed against embassy gates. Papers were burned. Allies were left behind. For Vietnam, it was reunification. For America, it was reckoning. The most powerful military on earth had been defeated, not by force alone, but by endurance, belief, and limits it refused to accept. After 1975, Vietnam was finally one country again, but unity did not mean peace. Cities lay damaged, farmland poisoned, and millions of lives permanently altered. The war had taken fathers, mothers, children, and futures. Rebuilding was slow, painful, and often lonely. There were no parades, no victory songs loud enough to drown out grief. Vietnam had won the war, but the cost was written into every village, every scarred landscape, every silent family dinner. For the United States, Vietnam forced an uncomfortable question. What happens when power is not enough? Trust in leadership collapsed. Politicians spoke more carefully. Military doctrine changed. The belief that America could shape the world by force alone had cracked. This moment became known as the Vietnam Syndrome, a national hesitation, a fear of repeating the same mistake. Vietnam didn't just end a war. It ended an era of unquestioned confidence. Military academies still study Vietnam, not for how to win, but how not to lose. The limits of technology, the danger of ideology, the cost of underestimating local history and culture. Vietnam taught the world that wars are not only fought on battlefields, but in hearts, homes, and public opinion. Ignore those fronts, and no army is strong enough. Today, Vietnam is young, dynamic, and forward-looking. Cities buzz with life. Old battlefields grow crops again. But memory remains. Museums, monuments, and stories passed down quietly remind the nation of what was lost and what was survived. Vietnam does not forget the war. It lives beyond it. The Vietnam War reshaped nations, politics, and people. It proved that strength without understanding is fragile, that belief can outlast bombs, and that even superpowers have limits. Vietnam was not just a war. It was a warning, written in fire, memory, and silence. But the true impact of Vietnam was not measured in territory or victories. It was measured in what followed. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War was no longer just happening in the jungles of Southeast Asia. It had crossed the ocean. It had entered American living rooms. Every evening, televisions flickered with images no previous generation had seen. Body bags being unloaded from helicopters, burned villages, wounded soldiers staring silently into the camera. For the first time in history, a war was not filtered through heroic posters or patriotic newspapers. It was raw, it was immediate, and it was deeply unsettling. Journalists were no longer embedded to inspire morale. They were witnesses. A young American mother watched the news and wondered if the next face on the screen would be her son. College students began asking a question their parents never had. Why are we fighting this war? Vietnam was no longer distant. Vietnam was personal. As the war dragged on, American streets began to change. Campuses turned into battlegrounds of ideas. Students carried books in one hand and protest signs in the other. Make love, not war. Bring our boys home. These were not slogans written by politicians. They came from ordinary people. In 1969, millions marched across the United States in what became the largest anti-war protest in American history. Teachers, veterans, musicians, parents. Voices that rarely stood together now shared the same anger. For the first time, patriotism itself was questioned. Was loyalty obedience? Or was it the courage to say no? Vietnam had fractured the American identity, not by bullets, but by doubt. Not everyone fought the war in Vietnam. Some fought it long after they returned home. Young men came back carrying invisible wounds, nightmares, silence, guilt they couldn't explain. They were welcomed with confusion instead of parades. Some were called heroes. Others were called killers. Post-traumatic stress was not yet understood. Pain had no language. Many veterans struggled to find work, meaning, or peace. They had survived the jungle, but not the memory of it. Vietnam followed them home. By 1973, the United States began withdrawing its troops. The war was no longer politically sustainable. 2 years later, in April 1975, Saigon fell. Helicopters lifted off rooftops in desperate evacuations. Allies were left behind. The war ended not with victory, but with escape. North Vietnam had won. For America, Vietnam was not a defeat on the battlefield. It was a collapse of certainty. Vietnam changed how America saw war forever. No more blank checks. No more unquestioned trust. Future conflicts would be debated, protested, analyzed. Vietnam had taught a painful lesson. Power has limits. And in Vietnam itself, the land healed slowly. The scars remain. In soil, in forests, in memory. The war ended decades ago, but its echoes still shape the world we live in. When the fighting stopped, silence followed. But silence did not mean peace. In Vietnam, cities lay broken, villages erased from maps. Fields once green were poisoned. Children were born into a war they never fought. Rebuilding was slow, painful, and lonely. There were no cameras anymore. No headlines. only survival. History often remembers wars by their battles. Vietnam was remembered by what remained afterward. Time passed. Slowly, Vietnam began to rise again. The country changed its path, opening to the world while holding on to its scars. Markets replaced bunkers. Motorbikes replaced military convoys. The war did not define Vietnam forever. Survival did. A nation once known only through war footage quietly rebuilt itself. For the United States, Vietnam left a permanent hesitation. Every future conflict carried its shadow. Politicians spoke more carefully. The public asked harder questions. Vietnam had ended the illusion of easy victories. War was no longer distant. It was personal, costly, and visible. America had learned restraint, not by choice, but by experience. Vietnam was the first televised war, but not the last shaped by media. Images had power, more than speeches, more than slogans. From that moment on, wars would be fought not only on battlefields, but on screens. Vietnam taught the world that perception could decide outcomes. Vietnam did not divide countries. It divided generations. Parents and children stopped speaking the same language. Trust fractured. For some, the war was necessary. For others, unforgivable. That divide still echoes today. Every war leaves lessons. Vietnam's were written in blood. Underestimating an enemy. Ignoring culture. Believing technology alone could win hearts. These lessons would echo for decades. Today, Vietnam exists in memory more than headlines. Memorial walls carry thousands of names, each one a life paused in history. Remembering is not about reopening wounds. It is about understanding them. Strategies fade. Borders change. What remains is human cost. Vietnam reminds us that wars are never abstract. They are lived, one person at a time. Vietnam matters because it warns us. It asks uncomfortable questions about power, about truth, about responsibility. Ignoring it risks repeating it. The Vietnam War ended on paper in 1975, but in memory, it never truly did. It lives in history books, in families, in questions we still ask today. Vietnam was not just a war. It was a turning point.